What is leadership? This is the question that we will try to answer in this video. In fact, I asked you this question last week and you gave some very interesting responses to this question. So I will start with analyzing some of your responses. Because I can't afford to make this video too long, so I won't be able to analyze all of your responses, but I selected few of the responses and I will analyze those responses. And then finally, I will share my thoughts on what is leadership. But before I analyze your responses, here's a word of caution. Don't take my analysis personally, because my objective is not to put you down. And I'm saying this because on several past occasions, I have seen that some students feel bad, feel hurt when I take apart some of their statements. As I said, my purpose is not to show you in bad light. My purpose is to help you gain clarity about the topic that I'm teaching you. So keep that in mind. Okay. Plus, I want you to be good critical thinkers, which means that you should be open to critically analyzing the thoughts, the ideas of a person, or the ideas that you read in a book or in your textbook. But any time that I'm critiquing an idea or a thought, that's what I'm critiquing. I'm not critiquing the person who came up with the idea, right? Okay. So if we approach our life or our learning from that perspective, then we will be better learners and we will actually be able to master whatever it is that we are trying to learn. Okay. So approach this from that perspective. So one more thing actually that I should mention. Many a times I will question you on things that you may actually have mentioned very correctly. And I will do that by taking up the role of a devil's advocate. Okay. Does not mean that whatever you have said or written is wrong. Okay. But sometimes I will question you hard to make sure that you actually have good clarity about what it is that you are saying, to find out whether you can defend the arguments that you're making. So that is something that may also happen. May not necessarily be in this video, but in some of the later talks, that could also be the case in the discussion forums. So keep this in mind before we move forward. Now here's your response. You said that leadership is being able to facilitate success for others. I think it's a great definition. But let's think about it a little bit deeper. So leadership is being able to facilitate success for others. I mean, of course, you have elaborated that by giving, more statements, but your primary definition is this. Is that always true? That's the question that I would like to ask. Let's take the example of, say, my servant or or the janitor in my office. The janitor in my office comes, cleans up my workspace, keeps the room clean, which actually helps me be successful in the work that I'm doing, right? If I had a messy workplace, then I won't be as productive. And that may, even though I don't have a servant here, but back in India, in my family, we had a servant who would take care of cleaning. And that person with that work actually helps me be more successful, more productive in the work that I'm doing, right? So can we call the janitor in my office or the servant at home a leader? That's a question that you have to answer. Based on your definition, the servant is a leader, right? So let's go to the next response. In this next response, we see that you are defining leadership in terms of working towards a goal with others while being encouraging and a great communicator. You go on to mention that leaders may sometimes have the confidence, sometimes they may not, but a leader will work beside you and does not undermine you. You say ultimately that leadership is a skill. There is no doubt that there is a skill aspect to leadership. Some leaders are more skilled in whatever it is that they are doing. Some are less skilled. So there is a skill approach to studying leadership, no doubt about that. But the primary definition that you have here, that leadership is about being encouraging. Is it possible that somebody is not very encouraging? Somebody, let's say, who may even put you down, may is not trying to pep you up, not trying to motivate you, not showing trust in your abilities. So that's typically what we mean by somebody being encouraging, right? So somebody who doesn't do any of these things, somebody who probably is very tough, doesn't show care towards you and pushes you to, to work even harder, uh, doesn't show trust in your abilities. Is such a person not a leader then? Or is it required that a person has to be encouraging, the person has to be caring, person has to work beside you in order for that person to be called a leader? Same logic could be applied to great communication. Now, what exactly do we mean by great communication? Being a great communicator may vary, but I'm sure you have come across people who were not great communicators in the traditional sense. They may have language deficiencies, both in oral as well as written communication. They may not be great orators, yet they had great fan following, for instance. Yet they had people who were willing to do a lot of stuff for them. So such people, are they then not leaders? That's the question. In here, we see that leadership is something that starts with a goal. Okay, the leader must have a vision to keep striving and never settling. It is important that a leader listens to his or her followers, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so let's just analyze this part. Here, the claim is that a leader must have a vision. So when a leader does not have a vision, when a person does not have a vision, does that mean that this person is not a leader? That could be the case, right? For instance, your immediate supervisor may have little to absolutely no role in creation of the vision of the company, because the vision is typically vision, mission, those things are typically decided by the top management of the company. Then your immediate supervisor, can we say that he is not a leader? In here, when you say that leader listens to his or her followers, well, again, I'm Not that anything wrong with listening to one's followers, the same way there is nothing wrong with having a vision. But my question is, if we define leadership in terms of listening to followers, when a leader does not listen to his or her followers and takes unilateral decisions on his own, then is that person not a leader? We have had several people in history who were, very autocratic in their approach. Even in the modern technological companies, Steve Jobs comes to mind. He had his own way of thinking how a certain product should be designed. He wouldn't listen to customers. He wouldn't listen to his subordinates. He had his vision of what the product should be like, and that's what he wanted his employees to work on. He was not listening to his followers, if you have read his biography. So then, can we say that Steve Jobs was not a leader? So what do we see here? We see being a leader is about having a passion for something and finding an effective way to share and teach your passion to others. So again, the question, now you should be getting pretty familiar with the way I'm questioning you. When somebody does not have that passion, are we going to say that this person is not a leader? Or is it always true that when somebody has a passion for something, that person is a leader? I may be very passionate about, say, I am very passionate about music, okay? Uh, and I spend, say, 8 hours per day trying to explore music, and that's all I do, apart from that's not true. uh, but imagine that's the case, that I spend 8 hours per day apart from, all my work hours, all my remaining waking hours I spend in music and exploring music. That's all I do. I'm extremely passionate about music. Does that then make me a leader? Or let's take the example of some very effective manager who is not necessarily passionate about his job or her job. Now, this person is very good at his job. He organizes things really well. The people working under this person do whatever this person asks them to do, but this person actually is not necessarily passionate about the job. Okay. Now, are we going to say this manager is not a leader? Hope you are getting the line of questioning that I'm doing. In here you later on mention about certain qualities: creativity, enthusiasm, dedication. Yes, great qualities that will certainly help in you being more effective as a leader. You later on add certain few more things: selflessness, purpose, drive, adaptability. Again, I think these are good qualities to have. But when somebody is not selfless, when a person in leadership role is not selfless, are we going to say that this person is not a leader? When a person is not creative, is this person then not a leader? In other words, when we are trying to define something, we are saying that anything that falls within that boundary, that's what leadership is. Anything that does not fall within that boundary, then that is not leadership, right? So when we are defining something, we are actually confining. We are setting boundaries. Anything that falls within that boundary will be what that concept is. Okay, so that's how I want you to think. So in here we see that leadership is defined in terms of consistency, right? So when you are being very consistent in your approach, you are a leader. Similar to the arguments that I have made before, yes, I would say consistency is a good thing. There can be certain situations where consistency can be problematic, but let's leave that aside. Let me accept your argument that consistency is a good thing. But is that synonymous with leadership? In other words, when there is lack of consistency, does that automatically mean that we do not have leadership? That's the question again. You have to answer. Okay. So now we see leadership being defined in terms of being able to connect with others. Okay. So are you being able to connect with others so that people can relate to you, and that's how you build a culture in your organization. Culture where people find it enjoyable to work. Okay, so they find it enjoyable. Well, it's a well-functioning workplace. That's how you talk about it. So when the workplace is not enjoyable, does it mean that the person leading that workplace is not a leader? Okay, so in other words, is being able to connect with others and making the workplace a enjoyable, fun place to work with, is that a requirement for leadership? So that's how we are thinking here. Leadership, you then talk about in terms of making important decisions. So when a person is not making important decisions, when a person in leadership role is making trivial decisions, day-to-day decisions, let's say, not important decisions that will have huge implications on the finances of the company, or huge implications on the lives of the people working in terms of whether they will have an income and so on and so forth. When they are making small decisions, trivial decisions, day-to-day workplace decisions, then people in such roles, are we going to say that they are not leaders? So we'll just go through a couple more definitions. So in here, what do we see? Leadership is the quality to inspire and influence others to both collaborate and accomplish individual tasks. Okay, so leadership is a quality to inspire others, right? That's what we are seeing here. If you don't have that quality of being able to inspire others, are you then not a leader? Not all leaders follow that approach of trying to inspire you, right? You further go on to say that true leadership has to have a servant's heart. So you are emphasizing the fact that a leader has to have the heart of a servant. There is a theory of leadership called servant leadership, which we can talk about later. But we are not talking about servant leadership right now. We are talking about leadership. Okay. So not all leaders have a servant's heart. Not all leaders try to approach leadership from the perspective of trying to serve the people, right? So those people, then, are they not leaders? Ability to lead by example, integrity, hard work, again, these are all good things. If you can lead by example, if you have high integrity, if you are a hardworking person, yes, these are all great things. But does that mean that somebody who does not lead by example cannot be called a leader? Somebody who does not have high integrity, can we not call those people leaders? Or the opposite, somebody who works very hard as I was giving the example of, let's say, me working on some music. I work very hard on my musical notes, but that's what I do. I just sit in my room by myself and work very hard. So if I'm a very hardworking person, does that make me a leader? Right? So those are the kind of questions that we need to think about. Okay, this is the last response that we will go through. In here, you are seeing that leadership can be described in a variety of different ways. And that's true. Leadership can be described in a variety of different ways. There are thousands of definitions of leadership. There are hundreds and thousands of books on leadership. And many of these books have their own take on what leadership is. So it is true that leadership can be defined in a variety of ways. Now, does that mean that there is no consensus in the field about what leadership is? No. Um, for a long time, we didn't have that consensus, but after a lot of brainstorming over decades, researchers in the field do have some consensus about what leadership is, and that's what I will discuss next. But leadership does not necessarily have to be about position. You are right about that. Leadership, sometimes you may not have the official position of leadership. Leadership can still exist without you having an official position of leadership. Then you talk about traits. The way I mentioned that there is a skills approach to leadership, similarly, there is a trait approach to leadership. So there are certain traits that are associated with effective leadership. Many of these traits you guys touched upon in all your definitions, right? But when we are talking about traits, we are talking about traits that help you be an effective leader. Having certain traits does not automatically make you a leader. So that's a distinction there. Okay. Certain traits help you be more effective as a leader. Certain traits prevent you from being effective as a leader. But traits are not the same as being a leader. Anyway, we will touch upon these things later. Okay, so I have been critiquing all your thoughts on leadership, but then I have to tell you what leadership is. And yes, as I mentioned, we do have consensus in the field about what leadership is. The consensus may not be, 100%, but to a large extent, I would say 90, 99%, we do have an agreement in the field about what leadership is. The definition that I'm going to share with you may not be the exact same words that you see in your textbook, but mostly the same. I just have simplified things even further so that you get clarity about what leadership is. Okay, so here's what leadership is. Leadership is the process of influencing others to achieve goals, or we could probably add the word common there, to achieve common goals. So this is how we define leadership. Now, how is this definition different from what you have shared before? You will understand this if we analyze this definition minutely. Okay, so this definition, even though it's a very short sentence, it has three major components. First is that we are defining leadership in terms of it being an influence process. This is important. So how we influence, that may vary. We may sometimes influence by encouraging others, like some of you pointed out. We may influence others by giving them directions, do this, do that. I think some of you mentioned telling others what to do. Sometimes we may influence others by giving them rewards. Sometimes we may influence them by even punishing. them for not doing things correctly, for instance. We may influence them by inspiring them, by pepping them up through motivational talks. So this, or sometimes we may influence others through what you called as leading by example, right? So these are the different things that you mentioned, but it ultimately boils down to what? You are influencing others. So leadership is a process of influencing others. Now, how you influence, that may vary. Some methods may be more effective, some methods may be less effective, right? So we may have some effective versions of leadership, some ineffective versions of leadership. But remember, we were just trying to understand what leadership is. We were not trying to define what is effective leadership, what is ineffective leadership. That is a question that I will be asking you next. But leadership ultimately boils down to influencing others. Clear? If you are not influencing others, then there is no leadership happening. That's what the definition is saying. So that's the first component to keep in mind. So it's an influence process. But I must also emphasize on the process part of the word. I emphasized on the influence part, so how it is ultimately boils down to influencing others. But why are we saying process? Why are we not saying leadership is the ability to influence others, or leadership is the skill to influence others? Because sometimes you may have the ability, you may have the skill, you may have the trait, but you are not exercising that ability. You are not using that skill. Then no leadership is happening, right? I may be a very strong, able person with all the great qualities that great leaders need to have. But if all I do is sit in my room and do my, whatever, play games and watch television and just listen to music or read books, whatever it is, I don't interact with anyone else in the world. I just eat, sleep. Now, I have the ability, but I'm not exercising that leadership ability. Then there is again no leadership happening. So that is the reason we do not define leadership in terms of ability. We do not define leadership in terms of skill. You may have the skill, but you need to exercise that skill. So that is the reason we define leadership in terms of it being an influence process. Okay, so it's a process and it's an influence process. What's the next component? When we are influencing somebody, we are influencing others, right? That others could be just one person, it could be 2, 3, 5, 10,000 people. But ultimately, leadership cannot happen in isolation. In fact, the example that I was giving you before, if I just sit alone in my room, never interact with anyone, not even over the social media, not even over the internet, I just keep to myself, stay alone at home. That is not leadership, right? Even if some of you mentioned about being passionate, I may be extremely passionate, but I don't share that passion with anyone else. I don't communicate that with anyone else. I may be very disciplined. I think somebody mentioned about the importance of being disciplined, being consistent. Again, I'm being disciplined, I'm being consistent with whatever I do, but it's all about me. If I'm not interacting with others, then there is no leadership happening. Those things can be all great. That self-improvement thing that I may be engaging in, those things may be great, but we do not call that leadership. We define leadership in terms of influencing others, okay? Not influencing myself. So not trying to self-motivate myself. That is not leadership in our field. So leadership, in other words, is a group phenomenon. So that comes from the part of influencing others, right? In other words, there has to be a person who is leading and there has to be at least one more person who is being led. one of the ways that we can define leadership, though it is not a very good definition, is that a leader is a person who has followers. Now, this is a circular definition, right? We are defining leadership in terms of somebody who has followers. So, but there is some wisdom in here. If you have no followers, if there is no one who is following you, then there is no influence happening. So there is no leadership happening. Okay, so leadership has to be a group phenomenon. So it has to be between at least two people, so two or more people, one person leading and another person at least being led. So when you are influencing to achieve some goal. So the third component then is that leadership is a goal-directed process, right? When you're trying to influence somebody, you have a goal in mind that you want the person to accomplish. So leadership is also a goal-directed phenomenon. Now, again, remember, not all goal-directed phenomena is leadership, right? So let's say today I have the goal of practicing music for an hour. Okay, that's my goal. So after I finish making this video, I sit and practice music for 1 hour. Is that leadership? No. It is goal directed, but it is not leadership, right? Why? Because it does not meet the other essential components of leadership. Because leadership also has to be a group phenomenon. There has to be influence process happening between at least two individuals. If all I'm doing is sitting by myself and trying to achieve goals, that is worthy, that is great, but that is not leadership. Clear? So these are the three important components of leadership. All the three components have to be present in order for us to call something leadership. If any of these three components is missing, that is not leadership. Okay, so it is an influence process, it's a group phenomenon, and it is goal directed. Now, one thing that I will quickly highlight here is that I mentioned common in brackets, or I could have underlined it, whatever. Most textbooks will define actually leadership as the process of influencing others to achieve common goals. Now, this is the part where there is a little bit of ambiguity. Should it be common goals or should it be just goals? Let's say, it's late in the night. You are walking home from, let's say, your workplace or maybe from some party, and a mugger stops you, holds a gun to your head and says your money or your life. Obviously, even if you are a very strong man or great martial artist, still it is wise to just give your money and not risk your life, right? So let's analyze the situation. Are we going to call this mugger a leader? The mugger did influence you, right? So it's influence process. Now, the way he's influencing you is by holding a gun on your head. And it is a group phenomenon because there are two people involved, right? So there is the mugger and there is you. And there is influence happening here. And it's goal directed. The mugger has the goal of getting money from you. Is that leadership? I think most of you would say that that is not leadership, right? That is the reason we usually emphasize the common goal part, where the the leader and the followers have mutually agreed upon some goals that they want to achieve. But then if we make common a mandatory part of the definition, that also creates certain problems. Imagine imagine you are a parent. Some of you are actually parents, and your child, let's say, has a major love for sweets, for anything sweet. Okay, let's say she is addicted to sweets, and you put some restrictions that, hey, you cannot have sweets because that's bad for her health. Now is that leadership? Or you are forcing your child to eat some vegetables. The child doesn't want to eat those vegetables because according to him or her, they taste horrible, right? So you impose the goal on your child. You do not mutually agree on eating more vegetables and reducing all the sugar, right? You have imposed your goal as a parent there on your child. So if you impose those goals, then are we going to say that you are not a leader now because it is not mutually agreed upon goal? It's not a common goal? No, right? Most of you would say that, hey, this parent is actually a leader, right? So this is the part that is a little difficult to reconcile. But we will usually agree that this is what leadership is. Okay, so sorry about that disruption. I will, in any case, this is what leadership is, and I will stop the video here. Next week, we will go into the discussion of what is effective leadership. Okay, so we know what leadership is now. But when can we say that a leader is being effective? That is the question that I'm asking you now, that I want you to think about. Okay. Plus, there is another question that I want you to think about. Is there a difference between a leader and a manager, or are they same things? Those are two questions that I want you to think about. I will share my inputs on those two questions next week. Thank you.